They have a series of.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Frank Albro. I'm Principal Planner with the City of Santa Maria. We're here tonight to go over and introduce the draft general plan, housing element. We've been working on this housing element for many, many months, and we've had some prior meetings, and this meeting is to specifically go over the draft, to introduce the different sections, to go over briefly some of the goals, policies, and programs that are proposed with the draft, and to explain the public review comment period, which began this past Monday and will last till December 28th, I believe it is. So we'll go ahead and get started. I have a PowerPoint presentation. So for tonight's agenda, we're going to go over a review of the housing element, what the housing element is, why we do a housing element, and various laws regarding the housing element. A big component of the housing element is the sites inventory.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We need to share your presentation
Oh.
on Zoom. They're not- 1 moment.
There we go. All right, excuse me, I was not sharing my presentation on the Zoom. I'll just go back a slide to show everyone. It was just the introduction slide. So here we are. So again, tonight's agenda, we'll go over the basic information about a housing element. We'll discuss the sites inventory, which is the available sites the city has for future housing development. We'll go over the draft goals, policies, and programs that were developed with this draft housing element. And then we'll also discuss next steps on the housing element, which will eventually lead to adoption of the housing element by the city council and certification of the housing element by the state. So to introduce the housing element, the housing element is a portion of the city's general plan. It is to be updated every 8 years, and it is the only element of all the general plan elements that is required to be reviewed by the state. It demonstrates to the state, and it also shows and plans for housing development during the next 8 years or the following 8 years from its adoption. And as I noted before, the housing element is something that comes out of state law. And because of that, our housing element reflects the goals of the state in terms of its production goals and policies and programs. And the housing element must comply with all state law. So in the process of developing a new housing element, we first review our current element, go back and look at the element that's in place. We look at the programs that we developed 8 years ago and determine whether or not those programs were successful, whether we should continue on with those programs, whether a program was completed or is no longer applicable. And we do that sort of analysis. We also look at the housing needs of the community. And that is partly done through meetings such as this, public input, and also data that is produced by various sources. For instance, the census data. or some state data that Housing Community Development Department produces. We look at constraints, and that can be constraints, what they call governmental constraints. For instance, are our development standards too onerous? Do they slow or prevent the development of housing? It could also be constraints that are outside the city's control, the market, financial ability to get loans on the part of developers, those sorts of things. I mentioned the site's inventory. What we do is look at vacant sites within the city. We look at those sites that are properly zoned. In other words, the zoning and the land use designation on the site will allow residential development. And we go through a complete inventory of all the available sites within the city. We do an analysis of fair housing. And if you were with us at any of our prior meetings that we just had this past month, those meetings were specifically regarding affirmatively furthering fair housing. So we were looking at, are there fair housing issues, and what are the things the city can possibly do to correct those issues? We look at housing resources, which is not only what does the current housing stock look like. We look at how many code enforcement requests there have been. We look at new development of housing. We look at the age of our current housing stock and so forth. And then public outreach. This is part of our public outreach, the meetings we've been having. We have our website. We have taken some online surveys, some in-person surveys, and so forth. And then finally, the implementation plan. And that is part of the policies and programs, as well as getting the housing element adopted and also getting it certified by HCD. And when I say HCD, that is the state's California Department of Housing and Community Development. And they are the branch of government that is charged with reviewing every city and county's housing element and determining whether or not it meets state law. If it does meet state law, they certify it. Typically, a city or county will have to go through 1 or 2 reviews with HCD. HCD will provide comments on how they think the housing element should be corrected, and we determine how best to address their comments. So this is an outline of the public outreach that we have done so far. We have our city's webpage. We have news releases. We had a spot on TV. We have emailed numerous notices. We also had our online survey, which we had up and available between February and August of this past year. And we had 457 responses to that survey. We did a planning commission study session in March. We briefed the city council in April. I mentioned the fair housing workshops that we've had this past month. And then we have tonight's community workshop. Just so everyone is aware, when we take the housing element to the public hearings, they'll be noticed as well. So just to touch base, and I know I presented this in past sessions. These are some of the results that we've taken away from the survey, the online survey that we took. And what this shows here are the most frequently selected responses to the question. So when we asked what are the main housing challenges in Santa Maria, the most frequently selected responses were lack of affordable housing options, overcrowding, housing that does not meet the community's needs, and unsafe or unhealthy housing conditions. Both renters and owners of housing and people looking to rent, looking to purchase housing responded that it was very difficult to find affordable housing within the city. And then in terms of what respondents thought were the folks that need the most assistance with housing and housing issues. And the most selected responses were first-time home buyers, seniors, farm workers, female-headed households, and large households. So I mentioned the sites inventory, and that is, at least for the city staff, a big part of producing this housing element. So it all starts with what's called RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And this is a quantification of a statewide need for housing. The state produces a number that they feel would satisfy the statewide need for housing. They then break that large number up into regions, and ours being the Santa Barbara County region. They assign a large number to the county, and that number is then further broken up amongst the jurisdictions in the county, including the county itself. And so the state decides what the region needs to provide, and in a way, the region decides how that is going to be best satisfied and best accomplished. So for this RHNA cycle that is upcoming, which is going to be the same 8 years that our housing element will be valid for, the city of Santa Maria needs to make land available. We don't need to construct the homes, but we just need to make the land available for the construction of 5,418 homes. Furthermore, that 5,418 number is divided into income categories. And that has to do partly with the densities that are possible on the vacant sites. So for the lower income, a higher density site is required. For the above moderate, that can be our low density zoning, like our single family zoning. So we have this number, we have it broken down into affordability levels. It comes from the state. Now the city has to figure out where can these housing units go. And so again, part of it is the income levels, and that ties to the zoning. So higher density equates to the ability to satisfy the lower income needs. These are just some figures. These are from 2021. And for median income, for the number of persons in a household, very low, low, and moderate, those are the income levels, annual income that for instance, one person would need to earn $75,650 to be considered a moderate income household. So those are the numbers we're looking at. We can then look at rents. We can then look at actual sales prices. But for the state, they tie it to our zoning classifications. So slides kind of jumping ahead here. In the back of the room, I should just note for everyone, we have our available sites draft map, which shows the sites that we selected that we believe will satisfy all the needs that were shown on the RHNA or our allocation. So here's our table of how we propose to meet the state's required RHNA. Part of it will be satisfied through the accessory dwelling units that the city's been issuing. The state at one point in time did not allow cities or counties to count granny flats or granny units. But when they produced the state's accessory dwelling unit law, they also changed that so cities and counties can recognize that an ADU or accessory dwelling unit is a unit of housing. So we project over the next 8 years, another 1,500 or plus or minus ADUs or accessory dwelling units will be built. We also have projects that are in the process that have gone through a discretionary approval, been to planning commission, been to city council. Some of them have actually gotten their building permits and are starting construction, but those units are not occupied yet. And so those units we can also count. And so right now, as of like last month, there's 1,973 units coming online, either through projects that have been approved and or building permits that have been issued and not yet occupied. Then we come to the site inventory. And again, that's our available sites inventory. These are the vacant sites that have the residential zoning. And so 2,447 units will be satisfied through the available sites that we've identified. And there's the totals. So in each of the cases, in each of the income levels, we've exceeded the number that the state has assigned to us with either an available site, a project that's been approved and is coming online, or through what we project as future accessory dwelling units. So I'll just go through this briefly. I do want to mention, again, the city is not required to build or actually construct these units. Cities and counties are not in that business. We rely on the development community, individual property owners to propose new units. So these are just sites that could accommodate the allotment that the city's been charged with. These are sites that have residential zoning already. Many communities don't have enough land that's vacant and is zoned residential. And those communities will have to do some rezoning as part of their housing element. City of Santa Maria does not need to do that for this next 8-year cycle. So we have one large property up north that's been zoned residential. Part of that site is zoned commercial, but we have our what's called the mixed use ordinance. And that ordinance does allow combining commercial with residential. So we can still count that commercial portion of that property. There's a small property off to the right there, off of Donovan. Oh, I was going to just mention one other thing. The striped areas, FEMA flood zone maps. Now, some of these areas may not still be in flood zones. These maps are a little bit older, but the federal government hasn't changed the maps. But the state does not allow us to count any site that's in a FEMA flood zone for future housing. So here's some more sites. We do have a list of these sites in our housing element draft. So if you're interested in the precise locations, they're keyed by these numbers that are shown here, and you can look at the precise sites. And again, these sites may develop, they might not develop as housing. The owners may come in and say, I'd like to rezone to commercial. If that gets passed, the city might have to then find another site for that housing that disappears if a site gets rezoned, or that housing potential, I should say. And then here's a few more sites off to the far left, those larger parcels. That's part of the Area 9 specific plan. And that specific plan was approved with the possibility of mixed use residential units above office complex. And so that's why those parcels are highlighted in yellow. I did want to mention also that there's orange, yellow, and then the violet, purple color. That's the three different main affordability categories that we are accrediting these sites to. Doesn't mean they will just develop as affordable, but the likelihood is there because of their existing zone. So the other main part of a housing element is how are we going to accomplish this housing over the next 8 years? And that falls to the goals, policies, and programs that we include in our draft element. Now, some of these programs are continuations of ones that are in our current element. Some of them are brand new. So stepping back a little bit, we have the housing element contents. I've gone through most of this already, but you can see the general organization of the housing element, the introduction, it goes over background of state law, it goes over how we analyze the data and what data we used, the projected housing needs. We look at the methodology that the RHNA, how the RHNA was developed. We look at income limits, which was one of the slides I showed previously. Housing resources, land resources or available sites, financial and administrative resources. And then part of that is a new aspect, which is looking at energy conservation, because energy conservation is ultimately tied to the affordability of living in a particular unit. And then finally, we have the housing plan, goals, policies, and programs, and the objectives. So the summary of the goals. So the goals that we've included in this draft housing element are to promote new housing construction, to conserve and improve the existing housing stock, to reduce or remove government constraints on housing. Those are the constraints that the city can control. To address special needs housing, and that can be farm worker, senior, developmentally disabled. Those folks need housing, but they typically need special housing that's designed for that need. And then also to promote equal housing opportunities. And again, this goes back to the fair housing. So for the first goal, to promote new housing construction, we developed a few new programs. Some of these, as I mentioned, are extensions of things we've already been doing. So for instance, incentives for affordable housing. These are things that we already do. We provide density bonus for housing that provides affordable units as a portion of the overall units they're developing. We do reduce fees in certain instances for certain levels of affordability. And then here's a new program, accessory dwelling units. So the city has been issuing building permits for accessory dwelling units for the last 4 years. And over time, the number of units issued each year has gone up. As part of the housing element, we're proposing that we will be watching that number and monitoring that number to see if there's any fluctuation. We did a very conservative forecast for future units, and that again contributes to our RHNA. But if that number happens to go low, then what we're doing here is looking at what the reasons might be for that happening. Is there a way to correct that? And perhaps, is there something other than an ADU which could satisfy where we're having a shortfall? We have another new one, which is housing on religious institution sites. So one of the current state laws that was passed not too long ago allows religious facilities, churches, synagogues, whatever, to use land on their properties that happen to be vacant and develop housing. And it doesn't necessarily need to be housing for church members or members of whatever religious faith that is. It could be open to anyone, but they can use their properties, even if they're not zoned residential, to develop some housing. So the city is going to recognize that state law through our housing element. And then one that is more recent as well is surplus land act sites. And these are sites that the city owns, that the city no longer needs or are underdeveloped and underutilized. An example of this are the downtown project sites that are looking to be developed at the intersection of Main and Broadway. There's 4 main sites there that the city council had determined to be surplus. And there are development proposals for those sites to develop multiple units of housing. So one thing I did want to mention, there are going to be more goals under each of these, or excuse me, more programs under each of these goals. These are just the key ones to introduce everyone, but go to the housing element draft. There's going to be much more detail and explanation of each one in the draft. Minor home repair, that's something we already do. We work with other organizations in the county and in the area to help fund repair of housing. It can be improvements like accessibility improvements and so forth. Code enforcement, we have a current code enforcement team. We see our code enforcement as ensuring the habitability of units. There are many instances where our code enforcement team is called out and there's issues that make the home inhabitable or the habitability is questionable. So code enforcement works with the property owner to correct those problems. Energy compliance and conservation, we do some of this now. What this program is looking at is having us do some more networking with the power providers in the area to encourage rebates and whatever credits, assistance on improving weatherproofing and those sorts of things. And then finally, at-risk affordable housing. This is a program that we currently have. It comes out of many state laws. Affordable housing gets developed multiple years. There are some affordable housing projects within the city that have been here for quite some time. Those projects were approved with a timeline of how long they had to maintain their affordability. And some of those units might be coming due in terms of they may no longer have to be affordable if they've met all their requirements. Right now, for this next 8 years, there's only 6 units in the city that may be going out of an affordable context. We've spoken with the property owner and operator of those units. They say they have no intention of pulling those from being affordable, but we still have to list those as a program. So goal 3, reduce or remove government constraints on housing. We have a program in place already about permit process monitoring. The city prides itself on what we call the one-stop shop, where permits are submitted to our building division. Our building division routes those permits to all the divisions that need to review and approve those plans, and we turn those around as quickly as we can. This also applies to the planning process, the public hearing process, getting applications for housing development before the planning commission and before the city council in an efficient manner. A new thing that we're going to be doing is developing objective design standards. So an objective design standard is something that has quantifiable and specific guidelines for how something is to be built. For instance, your front porches shall be 6 feet off the face of the house. That's something clear, 6 feet is measurable, as opposed to something that's subjective, which would be provide a enhanced living experience for each resident. Well, what does that mean? There's no way to measure that. One person can think, well, that's enhanced, and the next person think no. The state wants us to move away from those subjective things, which make the process uncertain for developers. They're not sure what they do is going to satisfy that or not. Having a 6-foot front porch, that's pretty clear for the developer. So we're going to create a whole list of new standards for residential development that has objective design standards. We are going to look at our current parking standards. Our parking ordinance is many, many years old. We've developed some newer standards with our newer planning efforts. For instance, the downtown plan bases parking on number of bedrooms and size of units, not simply a unit has so many parking spaces. So we're going to be looking at that. And then we currently have 3 main residential zoning densities. We have our low density, which is R1. We have our medium density, which is 12 units per acre maximum, and that's R2. And then we have our R3 zoning, which is high density residential, and that's up to 22 dwelling units per acre. For a community of this size, the state is saying we should have at least one zone that allows 30 dwelling units per acre or more. So we're either going to be looking at our current zoning districts and modifying how much density each one can have, or we may develop a whole new zoning category that allows for a higher density. And goal 4, address special needs housing. So we already have programs for seniors and persons with disabilities. Part of that program is what's called a reasonable accommodation, which if someone with a disability needs to ask for a modified development standard, the city can help them with that on an individual basis. We already have provisions in our zoning code for supportive housing. We're just going to make those more clear about what supportive housing is and where it can occur. Similarly, low barrier navigation centers are a similar thing to supportive housing. We already have information about emergency shelters in our code. Low barrier navigation centers is a rather new thing that the state has established. So we're going to include that in our zoning ordinance as well, but it appears here as a program. And then finally, zoning for transitional and supportive housing. We already do have this in our zoning code. And again, this is just going to make it more clear about where that housing can occur. And then promoting equal housing opportunities. We do a lot of this through our neighborhood community, used to be called Special Projects Group. They do funding for affordable housing. They also communicate with the either renters and property owners in the community about fair housing laws and fair housing regulations. We do have a home buyer assistance program, and that's going to continue. It helps home buyers put down payments, or it helps with the down payment for home buyers. We do have a rental assistance program, and that is going to continue as well. That's for deposits for rents. It assists the first time deposit. We have tenants' rights information, and that's going to be continuing on our website and through the various agencies that we work with. We promote tenants' rights and fair housing. And then a new program is capital improvements in low income areas. And so we're going to be looking to do street improvements, right-of-way improvements, improve for multimodal transit, and also sewer and water capacities in many areas of the city. And so we're going to have a program that's going to help us identify those areas and do analysis on where money can best be spent. So that concludes the presentation on the draft. And as I mentioned, the draft is out for public review right now. We have it on our city's website. If you search Housing Element Update 2023 on the city's website, you'll find our website, our Housing Element Update page. And we put it top and center, draft housing element. There's a link to that. So you can pull up that document and read through it. There's a main section that establishes the programs and has some of the background, but the appendices is where a lot of the work got done to develop what is in that main document. So the public review draft is going to be available till the end of end of December. December 29th is the final day to submit comments on the housing element. What city staff will do then is review those comments, see if we maybe already have addressed those comments to the programs we have, or see if there's things that we may need to revise in the draft. We then will be most likely taking the draft to an adoption hearing with the city council. And that will happen at the same time. We're going to be looking at doing our submittal to HCD. And so again, HCD is the state's division or Department of Housing and Community Development. And they are responsible for reviewing the housing element. And they will most likely provide us with comments. I don't know that any community gets through with just one review. So we'll be looking at those comments, revising the elements, and then we resubmit to HCD. Our goal is to have our housing element adopted within the spring of this upcoming year by the city council and final certification by HCD before June. So that's going to be our next steps. And so that concludes my presentation. My name is up here on the slide. My business cards are out on the table there. You can also contact me. My links are in the webpage, as with all the other documents. Yes, and I do want to mention, we do have our housing element consultant, which is Lisa Wise Consulting, and they're here to help us answer any questions this evening. And we are also doing our general plan update. The housing element is one portion of our overall general plan. But because housing element is controlled so tightly by state law, we have to move forward with our housing element now, while the other portions of the general plan are still being worked on. So you will hear more about general plan, land use, circulation, and those sorts of things in future meetings and in future announcements. But the housing element follows its own a little bit faster track. So that concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions. We also have folks attending via Zoom, and we should be able to hear you comment. So if you'd like to raise your hand on Zoom, if you do have a question or comment.
I don't see anyone on Zoom.
All right. Don't see anyone raising their hand. Again, written comments, you can email the comments, you can drop off letters and submit to me. We do have one person in the audience. Go ahead, Lori.
So on some of the housing elements that we're reviewing right now, particularly the county one, it talks about an additional 20% over what was allocated by the RENA numbers need to be studied. Is that in this document, or how are you addressing that? Sure.
So in our analysis of the available sites, we looked at the low-hanging fruit first, and that's sites that exist that are vacant, that have the correct zoning. We found that with those, plus the ADU projection and the sites, the development projects we already have in process, we were able to completely satisfy the RENA with some left over. And I have heard that HCD wants to see a little bit of a buffer. We're going to approach it that you know, if we wanted to get further into, for instance, potential for redevelopment of downtown sites. We've had many redevelopment projects where developers come in, taken out 2 single-family dwellings, bought both lots, and now we have 12 dwellings in that same space. We didn't go into any of that analysis because we already got our number. So we're gonna submit what we have to HCD. We're gonna see what their comments are. But that's our thought in terms of addressing any kind of a buffer. We were extremely conservative with all of our numbers. So we'll see what the comments come out as. Yes.
Good question. I have actually 2. One is on the Green, and I find it interesting that Santa Maria has 5,400 houses they're going to be required to build. Yet unincorporated Santa Maria has 721.
Right.
They happen to have larger lots. There's more massive land. And who acted on our behalf? Where were these numbers? How were they allocated by the county? And did we have representation from our community here?
Yes, so as I mentioned, the state has an overall number for the entire state. They then break that number up and allocate it to different regions. I said Santa Barbara County, it's the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, SBCAG is their acronym. And they have representatives are made up of representatives from all the communities in the city. So yes, City of Santa Maria participated in that process. They get the number from the state. All of the different communities come together and we mutually agree on a methodology on how that number should be distributed. It gets very detailed and very complicated. We're looking at things such as jobs, housing balance. South County has many more jobs, much less housing. North County, Santa Maria, we've got a lot of housing, but a lot of our jobs may not even be in our community, may not even be in our county. And so out commutes and all sorts of different things were all put into this model. And then all the agencies, the cities, the county mutually agreed on the numbers that we were eventually allotted.
Was there an incentive given to some to take them off?
No, we actually argued for taking less. The number was not quite a bit, but it was higher to start with. But one of the main arguments we made was precisely the jobs housing balance argument. That part of the housing element is also having to do with transportation and the impacts of commutes and making people commute. So one of the efforts is to get a housing jobs balance in each community. And when you're out of balance, that means there's more commuting and more money needs to be spent on traffic repairs and maybe expansion of lanes. Well, maybe that could be avoided if each community had a balance of jobs and housing. So we were able to use that argument to reduce our number. And that's where you notice, like City of Santa Barbara, their number is quite a bit higher. Their numbers had started out lower at the beginning of the process.
If they're in an unincorporated area, it's 50%.
Yes,
That's-
they have more because there's more area.
So one thing I wanted to clarify, and I'm Dana Edie, I'm the planning manager, and you mentioned that we had to build the units. We don't have to build them, we have to plan for
That's
areas.
right.
to
I
put
did
them.
see.
But I want to make sure you knew,
Oh,
it's
sure.
not required that they get built. The one drawback to not building them though, just means that we haven't met our RENA allocation and built them, and so then there are some state laws that we're required to comply with. For example, there's a law called Senate Bill 35, which allows certain affordable housing projects to come through almost at an administrative level. But if we build all of those units, then we wouldn't have to approve, we wouldn't be approving projects like that. But it's so, I just wanted to be clear that we just have to plan for it, and as Frank mentioned, we were able to find plenty of area for it and even some extra area for units.
And that's of course by impacting the ADUs, which were impacting the single family dwellings that most people are working towards getting into a single family dwelling. And now we're making them be up to 3 units. And that's impacting the community and impacting our sewers, our safety, our parking, all those issues. So by making that be a priority in the city, it's causing real havoc. And I know you guys know that, you know, other communities are doing some things to solve that. And I have numerous friends that live out in the North area. And they said, oh, we're not, when we go to apply, they make us jump through all kinds of hoops because they don't want it.
Well, we do have you know, there are a lot of criteria that you have to comply with to build an ADU. We have an application process for that. In the city of Santa Maria, though, I think it might be a bit easier to build them than in Orchid. I used to be a planner in Santa Barbara County, so I know their process as well. But, you know, we do get a lot of the garage conversions to ADUs, and the state regs are set up to where that's a fairly easy process to go through as long as you meet the requirements. So we are looking at them carefully. Each application comes in, it gets routed through all the different city departments, and there is a process of review. And there are times where there may be 3 or 4 rounds of review with an applicant before it can comply with the regulations. So, but we do have quite a few that are getting permitted and built. And it's really driven by the state law that the city has to comply with.
And so the things that the city isn't doing to curb it, parking permits and this kind of thing. So, you know, that's just, you know, 17, 18 people.
Yeah.
Is really impacting a lot. And I can see new build, you know, I can see the new builds that are coming in, having requirements of ADU being, you know, mandatory, or so when you go in and buy something, you're well aware that this is part of the city planning project, you know, that you can, or we've already built this project with the understanding that there could be or should be or would be percentage of them have ADUs. But when you're taking homes of 40, 30, 40, 50, 60 years of homeowners, and now telling that you now live in a boarding house complex, and it's really causing to know that. Just voice it.
Thank you.
I find it lucky.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. There are 2 people on Zoom with their hand raised. And so I thought maybe we could go to them, but also Frank, I don't know if you want to unshare your
Yeah.
presentation, then they can see us, I think, in the room. Yeah, for stop share.
Yeah.
at the top. So I think the camera should be working.
There we go.
Okay. So do you want to go to Zoom then? We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so Nadia, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, thank you. My name is Nadia Abushanov. I'm here on behalf of SPCAN, the Santa Barbara County Action Network, and I just had a couple questions about the process and the timeline going forward. So will this be the last time, this 30-day period, will this be the last time for public input on the housing element, besides like public comment at city council meetings when they're approving it?
This is the official public comment period for the draft.
Okay.
This is what the state law has set up. But as you mentioned, planning commission meetings, city council meetings, there's going to be opportunity for other comments to be made.
Okay, but there won't be like a designated 30-day window or something like that after the HCD comments come back, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
In terms of public comments.
Okay, great. And then just a couple other things. I'm a little bit concerned about the reliance on ADUs, especially for the very low income. We've seen in other places across the state and in the county that it's just really hard to know whether those really are affordable or not, and often they're kept empty or even used for short-term rentals or just used for you know, an extra guest room or something like that. So and I know I understand that the state says that it's fine to count them towards that, but I just have that concern, and I need to look more closely at the draft before making any more substantial comments, but just wanted to say that, I guess. And then I'm really pleased to see on goal 5, the tenants' rights information being a new goal. And I wonder, again, I haven't had a chance to look at the whole document, but I wonder if there's anything more you can say about that, and what, if you have ideas for what that program looks like right now, or if that'll be fleshed out more down the line. So yeah, those are the two things, just the ADUs and the tenants' rights right now.
Sure. So I did want to just say that with the ADUs, again, we were very conservative with our projected numbers. We based the number off of the last 4 years of ADU permits that have been issued. And then we took a big percentage off of that to come up with the number that we're using for the overall ADU count. Part of what we also did was a telephone survey of those property owners that had built an ADU and received their certificate of occupancy. And we asked them, what are you using your ADU for? Are you charging rent? If so, how much are you charging? It was an informal survey, but we got more than 30 responses, I believe, of the ADUs we did investigate. And at that time, we used the county's income levels and what would be appropriate rent. Many of the rents were in the low category. There were some that were above moderate and moderate category. Then other folks were saying that their extended family, their mother-in-law lives in the unit. Well, that still we felt appropriate to count that because it is serving as a unit for that household, which is the mother-in-law. So that's part of what we looked at. But again, we were very conservative with our projection. And that's only a part of what we're looking at for the overall available sites. In terms of the tenants' rights, I will look a little bit more into this. And the effort is to communicate and distribute information, regional tenant rights resources, any other relevant resources to inform both residents and property owners. Multiple language outreach will be conducted. And again, that will be through our community development department, our community projects division. We do quantify, the state has asked all communities to quantify their programs. What do you expect or what you project will come out of this? And so we do have to say, okay, well, we're going to communicate to at least 80 households over the planning period and provide them with information. That's a number very difficult to pin down, but we are going to make efforts to improve what we already have in terms of that communication. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for this presentation. It was really informative and I'll be, I'll be sending some further written comments, but yeah, thanks so much for hosting this.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have Jeffrey Wheeler.
Good evening, Frank. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So my first question has to do with your site inventory. So do they include unoccupied or underoccupied housing?
No, again, we went through and started with the easiest tasks and the low-hanging fruit in terms of what sites do we have available. So the majority of the sites are completely vacant. There are a couple of sites that may have a couple of homes or a couple of units on them. For instance, the site that I was pointing out, that's far north Broadway. I know there's a couple of units on that site, but it is a very large site. So it's extremely underutilized as a property. But the next step, if we needed to find more available sites, that would have been the next step, is looking at those project sites where there's maybe one unit or two units on a larger property and starting to count those. But we didn't need to take it to that step in terms of the analysis, because we were able to find enough vacant sites to make our numbers work.
And is there any consideration of taxing unoccupied units?
I have heard of that as a possibility to incentivize property owners to get their units occupied. In this current draft, we don't have any such program. One thing I should mention as well is that this housing element is meant to take a snapshot of time of where we're at right now, and then project out 8 years about how we're going to develop in the next 8 years. Simply because an idea or a program isn't in this draft doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be something that happens. We haven't really heard much about those programs, or if Santa Maria has a big vacancy rate, which I don't believe we do. I think our units are fairly well occupied. Our vacancy rate is fairly low, is my understanding. But if vacancy rate, what is identified as being an issue, a program like that might be something to consider.
Okay. Thank you for that. I will tell you that within a 2-block radius where I lived in the Carriage District, there are 4 empty units. For tenants' rights, you're looking at a program to inform tenants of their rights. Is there any movement to improve their rights, such as eviction control, or better defining what it means to take a unit off a market?
So again, in this draft, there aren't provisions like that. What we are committing to do is follow state law, follow federal law, and also communicate that information to residents and property owners. But we feel that those efforts will address issues that we might be having now. And that's where we're looking at those efforts to satisfy that requirement.
Okay, thanks. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Go back to the room.
Sure.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
thank you for all your hard work. I know this is not an easy process. You put in a lot of time. I can I have no idea how you got through. I have a conceptual question, I think. I'd love to think that things were black and white. Where there's a very good, I haven't read the entire document yet, but I'm going to work. The housing needs assessment, the appendix A is quite in depth. And identifies a lot of problems. But then I go to the housing plan where I expect to see solutions. And I don't see much one-to-one kind of. This solves that problem that's identified in the assessment. So I don't know how to track that. Other than say, I try to remember what I read as a problem. For example, the issue of overpayment. Really an interesting conceptual kind of thing, which I live with every day. And I think is at the heart of the affordability issue in this area. But I didn't see a lot addressing overpayment in any area of the housing plan. And I just wondered if that's just too big, too complicated, doesn't really fit with building units or meeting units. It's
That is a difficult issue to address, and it's a difficult issue to find a solution for. I know part of the housing element in terms of the projected numbers of units to be built is hoping to address the demand for housing. If there's more supply, the demand will go down, and theoretically the cost will go down. So overpayment instances will go down. But a lot of it has to do with the market and the economy and just the demand to live in California on the Central Coast. And that's something that directly controlling that demand is something the city can't do. There's no way that I know of that a city could do that, other than trying to address that demand with producing more units or having space available that the market, the developers can come in and produce those units. We have, as you saw on our list, quite a few developments, quite a few units coming online in process. That's, again, just a snapshot in time. We've gotten more applications since then, but those aren't included in our housing element.
Jen has her hand raised.
Okay. So our consultant, Lisa Weiss Consulting, Jennifer Murillo is in attendance virtually, and she has her hand raised, and I think she has a way to address that comment.
Thank you, Frank. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. That's a great comment. And Frank, I think your answer is perfect. I just wanted to add on to say that there are a lot of programs and the state focusing on the supply side. So increasing that supply of housing and looking at providing a mix of housing types. So we're looking at providing housing such as ADUs that are smaller units, more affordable, looking at reducing parking rates for smaller studio and one-bedroom units, for instance, to looking at more affordable by design and different mix of unit types. But then there are programs supporting the first-time home buyer assistance program, the city helping to fund and support that, the security deposit program as well, and also looking at support for funding the home repair programs that can also reduce monthly costs. So it's a great question. It's not a problem that's easily solved, but the programs are looking at tackling it from different angles.
Thank you, Jen.
Sure.
Well, as you know, I'm the mobile home company that everybody recognizes. It's the guy making all the noise about mobile homes. One of the, in comparing the previous housing element, which I haven't read in depth at all, but I've seen some of the selections from it. The language mobile home is far less in this version than the previous version. A quick search of the word mobile in the 273 pages only provides 15 hits. And a good number of those deal with parking spaces. Okay, so it's kind of, from my perspective, it's kind of avoiding or ignoring some of the issues that we've tried to make so much emphasis on as needing to be addressed. There is no reference to the existing mobile or model lease program. There is no reference to any kind of rent stabilization effort that the city might be in tune with. There is tell me if I'm going over it. There is a program under the housing resources listing. That's a state program. That's never shown any implementation or time. It's the MPRROP. As how it could be rolled in to address some of the mobile home issues in Santa Maria. So I found that kind of interesting. Again, with recognizing a problem, which clearly is addressed in the assessment. And there's a resource that wasn't applied to try to answer the need. So I just throw that out there as something that might deserve some attention, and I'll be providing you with written comments.
All right, thank you. Go ahead.
I'm Brian Tedley with Urban Planning Concepts. I wanted to amplify one of the comments from the woman from SDCan about the seemed over reliance of ADUs, especially with the low income categories. Because it seems that a lot of the most successful low income developments locally are located in specific ways, planned per se, to locate them near services or have integral services, including social services for residents, daycare, those kind of amenities, or near those type of amenities. Close to transit, close to shopping that necessarily don't have to get in the car. And by their very nature, ADUs are diffuse and really unplanned. They pop up. They're going to pop up, right?
Right.
So it almost like seems the opposite. So was there any effort to include comments in the early stages of this draft for the size inventory for local firms successful in low income housing developments like People Self-Help to maybe locate in the sites inventory a place ideal for low income housing? And just if not, I think maybe, because it looks like you have about 2/3 of your low income units depending on ADUs. And I know you said you're going to monitor whether that keeps pace, but I think maybe more emphasis, the state will probably comment on more emphasis for actual planning for sites for low income.
Yeah, there are two categories of low income housing, at least two. But there are those projects that are deed restricted, that they're looking for funding from the feds, from the state. California Tax Allocation Committee provides funding to build and construct affordable units. And that's where those 50-year restrictions that those units have to be maintained as affordable for 50 years. Those kinds of things come in with those types of units. But then there's also units that are just, one term is called affordable by design. And that's where the density idea comes from, where the state says if you have high density zoned properties, you can count those as projected possible low income units. All through this next 8 years, every year we have to report to the state how many building permits we issued. Sorry, library speaker. How many permits we issued, and we have to tell the state what income category those units were in. If they're affordable, were they restricted affordable? In other words, was there funding associated and now they are restricted for a certain period of time, 50 years is the current, to be affordable? Or were they simply affordable due to their density or due to their design? And so each year we have to report, if we are moving through the process, let's say our numbers are approved by the state and our elements certified. As we move through the process, if a site rezones that we identified for residential, and now it's no way is it going to be residential, we may have to replace that site at that point in time. We may have to find another site to replace that number of units. Likewise, if we're not, if affordable units are not being constructed, that will show up in our reporting to the state every year. That's part of the ADU program. We're taking it a step further, saying, you know, our ADUs, we project those in this number, and we're projecting this amount to be affordable. But we're not just going to leave it to that projection. We're also going to monitor that. And if we're falling behind in our ADU production, or we're finding that, gee, all of them are above moderate now, they're you know, Taj Mahals and they're renting for huge dollars, then we're going to have to do something about it. That's part of the reason, part of our strategy in including ADUs towards our arena is that we're going to monitor those and make sure that they are in the affordability categories that we are projecting them to be in. But yeah, we had some early conversations with the state about our ADU intentions. And we believe that we're going to be successful with what we have in our draft here.
Jen wants to add on.
Oh, go ahead, Jen.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Frank. You actually just covered what I was gonna add on about is that, yes, the city of Santa Maria is projecting a lot of ADUs to help to credit toward the arena. But Santa Maria has a very solid track record of producing and approving ADUs that supports the projections. And as Frank mentioned, there have been conversations with HCD about the methodology and data to support the projections. So while it is significant, it is based and grounded in data and analysis that is supportable and will be provided in the housing element and reviewed by HCD. Now, that doesn't mean I don't expect to get comments from HCD. I imagine there will be comments and we'll have some refinement of this, but it is supported by the data that the city has and is presented in the housing element.
Thank you, Jen. Any other comments or questions here in the audience? Any other on Zoom?
No one on Zoom. That's
Well, I do want to say thank you all for attending, either in person or virtually. Again, my email address is available on the website. You can hard mail a document to us with comments or simply email. Either way is fine. Attachments are fine. As I mentioned, the public comment period will go through the end of December. And at that point, we'll gather all the comments, see if we need to do refinements or do additions or changes. And then we'll produce another processing draft of the element, which we'll make available publicly as well. We will be announcing public hearings, noticing those public hearings both on the website through news releases like this. This was advertised as well. So stay tuned and we'll be continuing through this process. Thank you. Thank you very much.
thank you. Uh,